All right.
Foreign Affairs coming too? We're going to do
Are they here?
Foreign Affairs.
So who's here?
Yeah, we got two. We got Shim Kids and Tom.
All right, here we go. All right, the Rules Committee will come to order. Today we are here to consider H.R. 9, a measure that well, yeah, just set it ready when you want. Okay. All right, good.
It's not going to change the vote.
I know. So we're here today to consider H.R. 9, a measure that stands up for science and common sense while putting our nation back on the path of addressing the climate crisis. The only place where there is a debate about the causes of climate change and its impact seems to be here in our nation's capital, in the Republican conference and in the halls of the White House. But the facts are clear. Climate change is happening and humans are playing a defining role. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said that the evidence of climate change is unequivocal. Every major scientific organization studying climate change agrees, as do 97% of climate scientists. You don't have to have a science background to know that something is happening. All you have to do is look outside your window. Things like historic temperature swings, stronger storms, and more intense wildfires are becoming the norm. Climate change doesn't just impact the weather. It endangers public health, our economy, and our national security. It is a global problem that requires a global solution. That's why President Obama entered the United States into the historic Paris Climate Agreement. It set an ambitious goal of keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius and established binding commitments for countries to reduce emissions. Nearly every country in the world ratified it, but inexplicably, President Trump has announced his intention to withdraw the United States from this agreement. We aren't out of it yet, but if the president gets his way, we could be starting as early as 2020. Now, maybe he wants to reward his friends in the fossil fuel industry, or maybe he just wants to overturn anything President Obama has ever done. I don't know. But I do know this. This majority is not going to stick our heads in the sand and reject the proven science of climate change and the urgent need to act. So this bill rejects the president's move and directs him instead to develop a plan to meet our commitments under the Paris Agreement. H.R. 9 is the Climate Action Now Act because we simply cannot wait to fight this threat. So before we hear from our witnesses, let me turn to our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks he wants to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a lot to say about the bill we're considering today. The majority has yet again brought up legislation that will go nowhere in the Senate and will not become law. In the immortal words of the philosopher and baseball great Yogi Berra, it's deja vu all over again. This time, the majority is seeking to bring up what amounts to a messaging bill on climate change. I suspect this is meant to serve as a substitute for the extreme socialist policies of the Green New Deal in order to satisfy the most vocal members of the Democratic caucus who want the House to consider that package. The bill we're considering today purports to force the President to return the United States to the Paris Agreement on climate change, yet it does nothing to address the serious fundamental flaws in the Paris Agreement, nor does it offer a substantial solution to the problem of a changing climate. Instead, like many other bills the majority has offered this House, today's legislation is all talk, no action. It's simply another messaging vote to allow the majority to go on record in opposition to President Trump. That's not legislating. To be clear, I agree that we must be good stewards of the earth and its resources. I do indeed believe the climate is changing and that the United States should take steps to curb our greenhouse gas emissions. Indeed, I've offered and succeeded in passing legislation on wind power. I just also believe that attempting to force the president to stay in the Paris Agreement is not an effective solution. The Paris Agreement is not a treaty that is, it's not a treaty and is not enforceable. It fails to force China, the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, to make real changes toward reducing their emissions. The net effect of the agreement would be to force the United States to shoulder the costs of change in a disproportionate way and to make economically damaging changes without requiring the same commitment from other countries. It was unfair to the United States on the day it was signed, and it's unfair now. If the majority truly wants to address climate change and cares to actually legislate in divided government, we can certainly do better than the bill before us today. Instead of calling for the president to return to an unfair and ineffective agreement, we should be looking for real bipartisan solutions to reduce emissions and to put our economy on solid footing for the future. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the gentleman's comments, and I thank him for his opening statement. And I would just simply say that, when my friends were in charge for 8 years, I don't recall very many hearings on the climate crisis. And we could try to, apply that title to hearings on other matters, but I don't recall this issue being taken very seriously at all by anybody. And I think that needs to change because we are in a crisis. So I want to welcome Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, Chairman Tonko, and Ranking Member Shimkus. We're delighted that you are here. Anything you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record. And I begin with recognizing the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel. And anything that you brought, you feel free to summarize. We can give your text to the stenographer if that would be helpful. But we appreciate anything you want to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll be very brief, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Cole. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today, and I'm glad that we're here today to move forward with H.R. 9, the Climate Action Now Act, because we cannot wait any longer to address the serious national security threat posed by climate change. This is a threat that transcends borders and requires international coordination, and that's why it's so critical for the United States to work shoulder to shoulder with our friends and partners around the world. The negotiation of the Paris Agreement was such a defining moment for the future of our planet. For the first time, the countries of the world came together to face this global crisis. At times like these, the international community usually looks to the United States for leadership. So when President Trump announced his intention to withdraw from this landmark agreement, it sent an unmistakable message to the world that America is on the retreat. That's a mistake. It's shameful. Every nation in the world has signed on to the Paris Agreement, and if we withdraw, we will be the only country unwilling to step up to this challenge. So we must do better because we are already seeing the consequences of our inaction. Natural disasters, famines, instability, human suffering. I remember in my own area of New York City, Superstorm Sandy. The time for action to avoid the worst effects of climate change is rapidly closing. We must demonstrate to the rest of the world and to future generations that we're still committed to taking on this fight. The Climate Action Now Act keeps the United States in the Paris Climate Accord, renewing our country's pledge to address climate change head-on. The Paris Agreement allows every country to determine its own emission reduction targets and to develop a public plan for how to meet those targets. This bill follows that same model. It gives the executive branch total flexibility to decide what approach we need to follow and what kind of technology we need to use to reach our national targets. H.R. 9 gives us all an opportunity to show Americans that we hear them, that we take their concerns seriously, and that we are addressing this dangerous threat to their health and safety. It's time for Congress to put our country back on the right path to address the climate change crisis facing the world. So in summation, I strongly support advancing H.R. 9 to consideration by the full House, and I'm pleased to answer any questions you might have. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. McCall. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to just first say at the outset that I think we can all agree that the climate is changing, as Secretary Pompeo testified, and we need to take positive steps to address this crisis. However, I do oppose this bill because, among other problems, it attempts to codify President Obama's unrealistic greenhouse gas reduction pledge under the Paris Agreement. During a recent Foreign Affairs Committee hearing, I was encouraged that both sides of the political aisle expressed a shared understanding of the national security threat of climate change. Witnesses invited by both Democrats and Republicans testified to the importance of technology and innovations to address this challenge. However, the bill before us does nothing to bolster research or promote innovation. Instead, it recommits the United States to President Obama's pledges under the Paris Agreement, which was submitted on behalf of the United States without any role by the Congress. We were not consulted about the pledge to cut greenhouse gases by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. In fact, of the world's top 100 greenhouse gas emitters, the United States was just one of 12 countries to adopt the Paris Agreement through unilateral executive action. Even China's legislative body had a say in their country's decision to join the agreement. When asked by Mr. Zeldin at this month's hearing whether any of the witnesses disagreed that President Obama should have submitted the Paris Agreement to the Senate for ratification, all 4 witnesses, including the 3 invited by the Democrat majority, agreed that it should have. The Obama administration did not seek meaningful input also from the private sector. Not only that, but the administration provided no cost-benefit analysis or economic justification to rationalize the numbers in this pledge. All we have to rely on are third-party analysis, one of which has found that these commitments would cost the economy $250 billion in gross domestic product and 2.7 million jobs by 2025. And by 2040, could cost the United States economy $3 trillion and 6.5 million industrial sector jobs. Meanwhile, China, the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter, will continue to increase its emissions through 2030 under its unenforceable Paris Agreement pledge. The United States, on the other hand, saw a 14% reduction from 2005 to 2017. Other major greenhouse gas emitters like Russia have signed the agreement but have not ratified it. Instead of doubling down on a pledge that Congress had no role in setting that will have an unknown and potentially catastrophic impact on the United States economy, and which will do nothing to address China's growing emissions, we should work together on bipartisan legislation to boost research, advance technology, promote innovation, and develop real solutions. In short, Mr. Chairman, I think this bill falls short of what I have offered as an amendment, which calls for bipartisan solutions to address this challenge, provides a meaningful role for Congress regarding the Paris Agreement, and requires our greenhouse gas reduction commitments to undergo rigorous cost-benefit analysis. And with that, I urge the committee to make my amendment in order, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole and members of the Rules Committee for the opportunity to testify on H.R. 9, the Climate Action Now Act. I am proud to be joined by my New York colleague, Mr. Engel, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, in support of this legislation, which has some 224 co-sponsors. I'm here to represent the Committee on Energy and Commerce, which received a secondary referral and reported the bill favorably on April 4th by a vote of 29 to 19. Earlier this year, the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change held a hearing on the Paris Agreement, as well as a hearing examining subnational actions. In late 2015, driven by American leadership, the world came together to acknowledge the threat of climate change and make plans for cooperative global efforts in mitigation and adaptation, with the purpose to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to limit global temperature increase to well below that 2 degrees Celsius mark. To date, 195 countries have joined the Paris Agreement, including the United States. The ingenuity of the Paris Agreement is that it builds from the bottom up. It does not dictate specific reductions or remedies. Each country sets its own targets, submits a nationally determined contribution, or an NDC, to achieve those targets, reports on their emissions, and should increase their ambition over time. The United States, for example, committed to reduce its emissions by some 26 to 28% below 2005 levels in 2025. In June of 2017, President Trump announced his intent to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement. Although it is important to note that under the terms of the agreement, the United States cannot give formal notice of withdrawal until November 4th of 2019, with the withdrawal taking effect 1 year later. Since then, thousands of states, cities, businesses, and universities have stepped up and said, we're still in. If you add them all up, these non-federal actors would have the third largest economy in the world. This legislation is very simple. It primarily does two things. First, it prohibits the President from using funds to take any action to advance the withdrawal of our United States from the Paris Agreement. And second, it directs the President to develop a plan for the United States to meet its NDC under the agreement. The section on use of funds is under the sole jurisdiction of the Foreign Affairs Committee. However, E&C did have thorough debate on Section 4, which requires the President to submit a plan to meet the United States NDC of 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. The legal authorities for actions included in the U.S. NDC are derived from existing domestic laws, most of which are products of the Committee on Energy and Commerce that receive broad bipartisan support from Congress. This bill does not grant the administration any new authorities. Since the President's announcement, the administration has undone or delayed nearly all of the emission-reducing actions, including in the NDC. With that in mind, I believe Section 4 should be seen as an opportunity. If President Trump does not support the initial plan for meeting the NDC, he can develop his own plan to meet those reduction targets. Today, I hope I can help clarify a few points about the legislation that might inform your amendment process. First, I am aware that a number of amendments seek to require this plan to include certain technologies. This bill is intentionally technology neutral. Nothing prohibits the President from selecting any technologies or strategies to achieve the 2025 target. We did not want to dictate the President's approach or pick winners and losers. So I would caution against amendments that seek to limit the President's ability to develop this plan. Second, a number of amendments questioned the commitments of developing nations or demand equivalent reductions. We should all keep in mind that the United States remains, far and away, the largest historic emitter of climate pollution. Among large annual emitters, the United States is also by far the largest per capita polluter. Our subcommittee received testimony that China is on track to peak its emissions earlier than had been previously committed. Meanwhile, America's CO2 emissions rose by some 3.4% in 2018, the largest increase in some 8 years. Having a seat at the table is the best way to hold other nations accountable and pressure them to increase their ambition. Third, the United States is not acting alone. 195 countries, representing all types of governments and political persuasions, have signed the agreement. President Trump is the outlier. And finally, it is not accurate that innovation and technology development are responsible for all of our progress thus far, or the sole solution for future success. I strongly support energy innovation. It was a big part of my job leading NYSERDA before I came to Congress. But solely focusing on technology development is far too dismissive of the role that economic factors and smart policies have played to drive technology deployment and market creation. The fourth National Climate Assessment has made it clear that the window for meaningful climate action is shrinking faster than previously expected, and the effects will be far greater and felt more intensely by every part of the country. This legislation is not a climate silver bullet, but it is a step in the right direction for any member interested in national and global efforts to address the real and growing threat of climate change. The United States cannot hide from the mantle and the accompanying responsibility of being the greatest nation on earth. We must lead, and others will be guided by our example. This bill has support from environmental and public health organizations, the NAACP, Businesses from the Business for Innovative Climate and Energy Policy Network, and the We're Still In campaign, which represents over 3,750 U.S. businesses, cities, states, tribes, and universities, amongst others. H.R. 9 is an opportunity to send a strong message, not only to our constituents, but to the global community, that there are people serving in federal government that care about climate action, that care about international cooperation, that take the commitments of our nation seriously, and that want to leave a safer, healthier planet for future generations. Thank you again for allowing me to appear before the committee, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cole. Thanks for letting us be here. H.R. 9 will not effectively address climate change risk. Whether or not it would ever make it to the President's desk, which I doubt, this bill continues to pursue an approach to reducing emissions that will not work for American public and would not have meaningful impact on global emissions. Without substantial revisions, H.R. 9 repeats the Obama administration's misguided approach that was to bind U.S. action without broad-based support from congressional policymakers. The Paris Agreement's emissions commitments, the financing pledges, and the costly and burdensome implementation regulations that would be needed to meet our obligations were not submitted to or approved by Congress. Without the national political buy-in on a complicated policy that would affect all aspects of people's daily lives, you should not be surprised a new administration would change course. There has been no close examination of what implementing a plan under H.R. 9 to meet the Obama administration's pledges would really mean. The best data we have from the Energy and Commerce Committee's past examination of the Clean Power Plan and other measures indicates people would have paid billions of dollars more each year for energy, leading to a large economy-wide impacts with little real impact on global emissions data. Affordable and abundant energy is a key ingredient for economic development and growth, and policies that threaten to make energy as well as industrial and agricultural output more expensive, less abundant, undermine this fundamental fact. No nation seeking to improve the lives of its citizens will accept energy or transportation constraints, and neither should the United States if we want to maintain a robust economic growth and remain globally competitive for future generations. These economic realities help explain why other developed nations are not actually following through on their promises in the Paris Agreement. Recent research in Europe has found that nations' commitments under Paris will not meet the actual goals in the Paris Agreement, and that most major nations are making few, if any, efforts to meet their goals. In fact, independent environmental reviews suggest that all European Union countries are off target, and those that have been making the most progress on their promises did not make large commitments in the first place. The United Nations Emission Gap Report reported in November that countries will have to at least triple their efforts to meet the Paris Agreement's basic goals, if not increase their goals fivefold to meet more stringent temperature targets. In France, we have witnessed the Paris riots, which were sparked over the government's climate-related proposal to increase gasoline taxes on rural French. You can read news stories about governments having buyer's remorse over expensive, unreliable energy. Given these economic realities, it's hard to see how European and other developed nations will be successful as they ratchet up controls and continue to raise energy costs. Meanwhile, the developing world will continue to produce almost all the growth in future carbon dioxide emissions as billions of people seek access to affordable energy, industry, and transportation. I would urge the Rules Committee to keep this in mind as you develop the floor package. Let's have amendments that recognize that plans and policies that push toward lower emitting systems in energy, transportation, industry, and agriculture will not work unless there is affordable technology to deploy at a massive scale. I've offered an amendment with Dr. Burgess that would protect consumers from higher rates and higher gasoline prices. We've seen how rushing regulations before viable technology is available can raise energy costs. This amendment would safeguard against this, and I ask that you make it in order. I think everybody understands that affordable, reliable energy is essential for a strong economy and providing for the welfare of communities, consumers, and workers. There are other amendments that have been offered that will help encourage energy innovation in nuclear, natural gas, and clean sources. The objective for all of this is to focus on economic strength and technological innovation. The United States needs to address future risk. There are many areas where we can work together to make it happen. H.R. 9, as it is not one of those areas. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's testimony. And let me just begin by saying that I don't think anybody's suggesting that the Paris Climate Accord is the be-all, end-all in terms of dealing with the issue of the climate crisis. There are many things we need to do in terms of an infrastructure bill that actually puts resources toward dealing with some of the impacts of climate in our country. I might go right down the list of things that we need to do. So no one's saying this is it, number one. But two, I mean, this is a real problem. And you know, I have farmers that have been farming for decades that when I visit their farms tell me that something's happening. Extreme weather patterns, droughts that are so severe that their wells dry up, or years of nothing but rain where they lose all their crops. They get it. I have mayors that represent coastal areas who have climate crisis plans in place because they're experiencing record flooding. Not quite sure what the future holds, and wondering what we're doing here in Washington, whether it's even a topic that we're discussing. And the reality is, for many years, at least in the Congress, we haven't been talking about it at all. And I appreciate all the calls to let's come together and try to find common ground. But I mean, I'm looking at an article here from November of 2018, when 13 federal agencies under this administration, so 13 Trump federal agencies, issue a report detailing how damage from global warming is intensifying throughout the country. And the president's response is that he's not amongst the believers who see climate change as a policy. That's the President of the United States. He says, and I quote, "One of the problems that a lot of people like myself, we have very high levels of intelligence, but we're not necessarily such believers. As to whether or not it's man-made or whether or not the effects you're talking about are there, I don't see it." I don't even know how you respond to that. And I mean, if you believe what he believes, I don't know where the common ground is, where the intersection is. I think it's delusional, quite frankly, what he has said when it comes to the climate crisis. But if that's what he believes, that's what he believes. And so this idea that we're going to, come together, working with him, who's leading the Republicans, to come up with some sort of a compromise bill or some sort of a bill that's going to address this issue, it's just not going to happen. This guy doesn't believe it, notwithstanding the fact that every major scientific organization in the world says it's real, notwithstanding the fact that every scientist who's worth anything in the world says it is real. So that's where we're at. Dealing with people who don't even want to say that there's a problem. Yeah, it's going to be complicated and complex to try to address some of these issues, but the Paris Climate Accord at least is a step in the right direction, something that we can all try to adhere to the goals in that accord, and instead we're walking away, and there's no replacement. It's kind of like health care. We repeal and no replacement. Walk away from the Paris Climate Accord, we have nothing more to say about it, other than to deny that this is a real problem. I don't even, I don't really have any questions other than to say, I don't think the president would sign this. I'm not sure the Senate will take it up. But I'm going to tell you this. I don't want my kids to say that we knew about this problem and we didn't even try to do anything about it. I'm enthusiastically supporting this legislation. I hope it passes, and I hope at some point we can develop a bipartisan consensus that this is a real problem, and the time to act has long passed. Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And gentlemen, thank you for your testimony today. Seas are rising, wildfires in Colorado burning like crazy, although we've had a little wetter year this year, but throughout the West, which puts, much more smoke up into the air. Extreme weather. We've had the members from the Florida delegation come in about a half a dozen times now to talk to us about Panama City and the panhandle of Florida and the Category 5 hurricane that just hit, so the extreme weather components of all this. So, Mr. McCall, I appreciate, you're a buddy of mine, and I appreciate your concern about the cost, but the cost of not doing anything is killing us too. Whether it's tourism in Colorado, tourism in Florida, just the commerce that our country depends upon, given this extreme weather. So, as you all were talking, all I could think of was Rome burning and narrow fiddling, because that's what we've been doing. And at some point, there's got to be action, and we haven't taken any action. So I appreciate, and your amendment is in the nature of a substitute, Mr. McCall. I don't have any quarrel with having some kind of component that talks about innovation. Mr. Tonko talked about it. So is yours as a complete substitute? Is that what your amendment is?
Yes. And I think we can all agree that it's an issue. I have a NASA scientist who briefed me on this saying, I'm not a policy guy, but the data is real. So I take it, I share the concern. I just think there's a better way to get there. And I think it's through technology and innovation.
Reclaiming my time.
Yeah.
You and I served on Homeland Security together 10 years ago. and we were talking about something's got to get done. So finally, we actually have an accord that had, I think Mr. Shimkus said or Mr. Tonko, 195 other co-signatories to this thing. I mean, that's just about the whole world, I would imagine. That in itself is a giant triumph. And for us to say, sorry, we're just not going to play our part. Mr. Tonko, Mr. Shimkus was saying, well, everybody's sort of not meeting their goals now. I would imagine that that's the case when the United States says, oh, by the way, we're dropping out of this thing. Has there been any conversation in your committee about the effect of our backing away from this agreement on the rest of the world?
There are colleagues I've spoken to that believe that with our absence at the table, there's not the pressure to move forward accordingly. And I believe that, in earnest, we can move that entire discussion so as to make certain that people are keeping in pace with meeting those goals. I think it's so important for us to be at that table. Walking away, first, is a very scarring impact on our image to the world. But more importantly, it's that partnership that can lead us to the innovation that these gentlemen speak of. But it's beyond that. We're not going to achieve our goals simply through the innovation economy, through the power sector. It needs to be economy-wide. And what's great about the agreement is that it offers flexibility to any of the participating nations.
And I thank you for that. I guess what I was saying, had Mr. McCall tailored his amendment a little more, I would have been in support of it, but not as a substitute for the entire agreement. That's not where I'm headed. So just all thank you for your testimony today. Obviously, I believe this was a big step forward, and now it's a big step back, and we've got to keep moving forward on this. And with that, I'd yield back.
Thank you. And again, Mr. McCall, I just say I don't think it is accurate that we all believe there's a problem. And I want to go back to the article I was reading, citing the President of the United States. I want to ask unanimous consent to put in the record Washington Post article from November of last year entitled "Trump on Climate Change. People like myself, we have very high levels of intelligence, but we're not necessarily such believers," where the President pretty explicitly says he didn't buy this stuff. And I find that to be particularly frightening at this moment. Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before I move to my questions, I'd ask unanimous consent to put a statement of administration policy into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, the last administration was famous, infamous really, for taking actions without congressional consent or approval. I remember going to war in Libya without anybody coming to ask the Congress of the United States whether it was okay. I remember an Iranian nuclear deal where we considered it under the bizarre proposition that 2/3 of us, had to be against it before it failed, rather than 2/3 of us being for it, a number it couldn't reach. So you touched a little bit on this, Mr. McCall, in your testimony, but I want to ask you again, did President Obama ever come to the Congress of the United States and, number one, ask for consideration of that legislation in the House or ask for ratification of that agreement in the Senate?
No, he did not.
You got any idea why he didn't do it?
I have my own thoughts, but the
I'd
fact
be
is,
interested in your thoughts.
perhaps he thought it couldn't be passed or ratified by the Senate.
Yeah, I suspect that's the case. He didn't have the votes, but he went ahead and did it anyway. Now, part of living in a democratic society is to actually engage in persuasion and discussion. It's not to preemptively move ahead, which almost always creates reaction. My friends are reacting that way right now on the wall. So if this is not a very prudent course that the last administration pursued. Mr. Shimkus, did President Obama provide any report on the economic justification, cost-benefit analysis, consultation with the private sector last time when this agreement was, being entered into by the United States?
Well, I think my colleague, and I'm just a simple guy from Southern Illinois, used to teach high school, is called an accord. Why isn't it called really an agreement or a treaty? And I think you raised that issue because it couldn't pass in both chambers. And that buy-in is critical if you want to really fundamentally change the direction of the energy economy in our country. whether it's in fuels or whether it's in electricity generation, and the buy-in was not there. Now, maybe it'll be, as people claim now with all the different organizations and groups saying we're not leaving coalition, and maybe there will be a consensus eventually. But no, the Obama administration did not bring forth to at least the House of Representatives any explanation or any defense of this agreement. They just did it. So we would be in a different position right now had it been an agreement like a trade agreement. We're having NAFTA agreements now, and we're going to have to revote on that. Or if it was a treaty, it'd have to go at least to the Senate. So why are we here? Why? Because the president was given authority. He gave himself authority to go into the agreement, and a new president gave himself authority to leave. I just find it instructional. This bill being on the floor is what a lot of my friends have talked about. This is a messaging bill, and I think Mr. McGovern, kind of agreed to that, because it's that really people really think a president's going to sign a bill enforceable on something that he's already agreed to not be involved with. So we'll spend a week dealing with this issue, and it'll go nowhere.
Let me ask you this. If the measure had been presented to the Senate, does anybody, and I ask this to all four of you, does anybody believe this bill, or as a treaty, would have ever been enacted into law by the Congress of the United States?
I don't think under the current structure it could have. It's unrealistic.
And why is it unrealistic?
Because the goals that it set, it's not based on economic reality, and it has no technology innovation in it. And I think the role of the Congress is important here.
And
We've talked a lot about Article 1.
Would the pursuit of those goals cost American jobs, cost American economic output?
Yeah, and in my testimony, I think the numbers, if you go to 2040, would cost the United States economy $3 trillion and 6.5 million jobs.
I'd admit that's probably why there weren't the votes in either the United States Senate or the United States House to approve this. You have my friend from New York, you have a comment to make?
Ranking Member Cole, I think it's important for us, both my colleagues and friends here on either side of me have indicated that the vote wouldn't have made it successfully in the House. I think that speaks to the denial that was gripping the overall House, that we can bury our heads in the sand and deny the issue or not want to address it, and that doesn't get us anywhere. I think the important thing is that we had an opportunity, we have still this opportunity to work with nations around the world to advance this notion of carbon pollution reduction. And it's not like we're going it alone. There is sufficient evidence that China, for instance, we talked today in a meeting about the very aggressive effort they're making on buses that are being turned to electrified and creating a huge impact on their reduction effort. We need to go forward and embrace the urgency that the president's own administration, his own agencies have advised him that the urgency is there.
Is the Chinese effort a net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions?
When you look at the per capita pollution from the United States versus China, we are a stronger polluter.
Whose numbers are going down and whose numbers are going up?
Our numbers went down, but then they went back up.
It went down the largest reduction of any major industrial country in the world since 2005.
But, sir, they're on the rise again, and we need to know
It's called a growing economy, which we didn't have a lot of that time, quite frankly.
Well, I think there's a number of factors you could point to, but rolling back CAFE standards, rolling back clean power plans, denying energy efficiency programs, all cause a greater footprint.
That's a fair point. My point would be, though, when you set up goals that can't be reached and you hold the United States to them, but you're not holding other countries to them, that's not a sustainable agreement. And there's no indication that other countries, my friend Mr. Call mentioned the European countries a minute ago, are making these sorts of gains. So you can believe there's a problem and just say this solution is the wrong solution, or these are too dramatic. You can never, long-term, deal with climate change if it lowers living standards and costs jobs. You've got to find ways to deal with it that actually do that. And we've done that to some degree.
But
Some of that reduction has been like increased natural gas production replacing coal. There's actually a carbon part of this as well, or being a lot more efficient, which makes money.
But there is flexibility associated with the commitment. So, Mr. President, give us your plan. Without any sort of addressing of a plan, we're nowhere. And so the flexibility is there. Tell us what your plan is.
It's not a plan if it can't pass the Congress of the United States and be sustained. And none of you denied that when this was presented, it could have passed the Congress. I'm not convinced it could pass the Congress today. As a matter of fact, I suspect we'll find out pretty quickly. It may pass the House, not likely to pass the Congress. So all I do is just make the point, and I won't take up much more time, but this is a messaging exercise. This isn't a real solution. It isn't a real program. I voted for real programs. I win the power. I've won all these kind of awards on that stuff. I worked with our colleague from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, years ago on legislation on small wind turbines, which my friends, I couldn't get enacted, to be fair. When we were in the majority, I got it enacted with Mr. Blumenauer's help the other time around. So I'm not against it. In Oklahoma, we produce a third of our electricity as wind power now. So, but those things have been cost effective. They haven't made life worse. They've made life better. And I, again, this seems to me sort of half-cocked. We're going to go back and try and force a president who's withdrawing from an agreement that Congress never ratified in the first place to go back to that agreement, even though other countries aren't making their goals within that agreement. And even though since 2005, which predates the agreement by over a decade, we have a better record than any other major economic power in lowering greenhouse gases. I mean, it leaves me skeptical of both the prospects for the legislation and the motive for the legislation.
But, Mr. Cole,
I'm
sir,
wondering, I'm wondering if I could just comment on some of the
Certainly.
things that have been said. Thank you, Mr. Cole. Look, we cannot use China as an excuse for inaction. I don't think that that's the right thing to do. In fact, if you look at what we've done recently and what China's done recently, and I never thought I could ever say this, China's the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter since 2005. China has created the world's largest carbon market, has pumped approximately 3 times as much money into renewables as the United States, and surpassed the United States in terms of both the number of electric vehicles on the road and the number of publicly available charging stations. China is also embracing the nexus between climate and security. In 2017, China signed onto a joint statement with the European Union terming rising global temperatures a root cause of instability. And on the global stage, the Trump administration's effective withdrawal from the Paris Agreement has created a global leadership that China has been quick to exploit. You look at what we're doing. We were once a global leader in pushing for climate action, but now under President Trump, we've all but abandoned our efforts to mitigate the effects of a warming world. And here's the example. In 2018, our emissions rose by 3.4%. And think about that for a minute. At a time when our world desperately needs to decrease emissions, ours increased. In a year where more dirty coal plants closed than almost any other year in history, our emissions increased. And that means that vast declines in coal use were not enough to offset the other harms caused by the administration's desires, and like working to weaken standards for ozone pollution, repeal the Clean Power Plan, repeal the Waters of the United States rule, withdraw the mercury effluent rule, eliminate the lead risk reduction program, repeal a rule regulating coal ash, weaken emissions. I can go on and on. So we're not really, unfortunately, a model actor here, and there is a problem. I want to also raise one other thing, and that is, as Mr. Cole was saying, that the U.S. is not a party to the PA because the PA was never approved by the Senate. the previous president did have authority to enter into the PA derived from the Constitution. The Senate approved United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and domestic law, and the vast majority of international agreements entered into by the U.S. are not approved by the Senate. So I don't think that that's a thing to do as well. I would hope that we could all put our heads together and acknowledge the fact that climate change is real and what is the best way of doing it. And I would hope, because there are good people who understand this problem on both sides of the aisle, I hope we could put our heads together and come up with something that really pushes us forward instead of pulling us back. And I certainly think that this bill goes a large way in that direction. Thank you.
Now, I would respectfully I agree with almost everything you said to the very last point. And I disagree, because this isn't putting our heads together and coming up with something that will change things. That's not what this is. That's not what this bill is about. It's about going back to an agreement that was never supported by the majority of either house in the United States, and an agreement the president entered in essentially unilaterally, leaving it vulnerable to the next president to undo it. That was his choice at the time. He chose not to work with Congress. He chose to put the bill at risk. And this doesn't, again, we shouldn't act on what the Senate should do. I'll be the first to say that, but I have a pretty good idea what the Senate's going to do with this bill. And the president's already told us what he's going to do with this bill. So I just submit it's not a serious effort. If we want to seriously deal with what we all acknowledge is a serious problem, we should do that. It should be moving through the Energy and Commerce Committee right now. There should be some effort to find common ground, because there are things where we can agree. We've agreed on wind power before. We've agreed, some of us grudgingly, on ethanol before, as my good friend, the other end of the table, is a big proponent of. So there are some things we could do in common. I just submit this bill isn't it. So it's fine to have a debate and an exercise. We've been doing a lot of it for 100 days. We've passed bill after bill that's going absolutely nowhere, because they weren't bipartisan. And I would just, hopefully, going forward, look, for the next 18 months, I know all of you want to do something. I know you don't want to just score political points, and that's going to require compromise. Look, our party had to learn this when we had a Republican House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic President. It takes all three to legislate. This isn't going to do it. So we can have a great debate, but it's not going to move us 1 inch closer to where you want to go. Whereas I would submit there might be some things we could do together legislatively that would advance us. So, yes, sir. My friend from New York had my other friend
Which friend from New York?
I will. I'll come back, but.
Mr. Cole, I just want to offer the observation. Chairman McGovern cited the non-scientific response by the president to his own agencies, a great number of agencies coming together, doing their required assessment based in a science and evidence manner. And his answer, I don't believe it. So this effort here is directing the responsibility. Congress has taken hold of a situation that these agencies deemed more deep than thought in terms of the carbon footprint and the climate crisis, and with more urgency. What we're saying is, Mr. President, act. It's Congress taking over in a bipartisan way, saying this is a crisis that needs to be resolved, and it directs the president to develop a plan. And I think that's straightforward, sound business, it's sound policy.
With all due respect to my friend, I do think it's a problem, and I wouldn't vote for this bill. You know, you're losing a lot of people that agree with you on the fundamental issue, but do not agree that these targets are realistic, or that we're really doing anything to meet them, or that it's a fair negotiation with other countries that puts them under similar things. So we can have that debate, but again, you're not getting everybody that believes with you voting in your direction. That would suggest maybe we need to rethink another approach. This approach was not successful last time. I don't think it'll be successful this time.
I'm wondering if...
well, of course. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out to my friend that the Paris Agreement was formulated under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was submitted to the Senate in 1992 and approved by Republicans and Democrats alike. The Paris Agreement, I know my friend will agree, is not a treaty. It's an agreement under an existing treaty, that the United States had already agreed to and ratified. And the Constitution requires that the Senate approve treaties, not subsidiary agreements under already approved treaties. And in fact, the vast majority of international agreements to which the United States is a party are not treaties. According to the Congressional Research Service, more than 90% of international legal agreements with U.S. support are agreements that do not require Senate ratification, and I would say that this is one of those. Look, I'm as frustrated as anybody. Global warming, climate change is real, and we better do something about it quickly before we all pay the price. So I appreciate my friend yielding to me.
Well,
Thank you.
I appreciate my friend's comments. As always, they're thoughtful. I would just say, in response, whether this we can do agreements under treaties, they're not treaties, and that's the point. I think you have to develop a national consensus. I don't think that was done by the last administration. I don't think this bill will do it. I think this is more about the politics of the moment than arriving at a genuine solution. So I'd rather my friends over in Energy and Commerce sit down and produce a bill in a bipartisan fashion that actually had realistic targets or suggested things we ought to incentivize or do through markets. I think there's a lot of those type of things. The progress we've made has been made mostly by the private sector and mostly through free markets operating, and businesses making the appropriate decisions, actually agreeing with my friends on the importance of the problem and making both efficiencies and substitutions in terms of their fuel sources to try and achieve these things. So that's been the one way that's worked, this sort of government one-size-fits-all approach and targets without serious processes behind them that lead us to where we can reach them have not worked. So with that, yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you for your testimony today on this important bill. It's been almost 2 years since President Trump's decision to remove the U.S. from the Paris Agreement, 2 years that have really set our nation back from meeting our international commitment to slow climate change, and 2 years in which, instead of leading the fight on climate change, the U.S. is missing in action, or maybe more accurately, has gone AWOL. In my district, we're seeing daily reminders that the threat of climate change is not only real, but already impacting us. Whether increasing incidents of extreme weather events, such as the tornadoes that touched down 2 weeks ago today in Philadelphia at 3 a.m., or record high and unseasonable temperatures that now turn our public schools into sweat boxes earlier and earlier each spring, or rising sea levels that impact not just our ocean front, but rivers such as the Delaware. We can't wait any longer to combat climate change. The science community overwhelmingly tells us this, but if one is not willing to listen to scientific fact, then we can take it from the Department of Defense, the actuarial community, religious leaders, and the legion of others who are acutely aware of the detrimental impact climate change will have on our planet. Beyond the experts and other leaders of today, we have to listen to the leaders of tomorrow. Our young people, whether college students, high schoolers, or even grade school students, recognize the existential threat that climate change is posing to their future. We cannot and should not wait for other nations to fill that void. Yes, developing nations like China and India must do more to address their own carbon emissions, but we can't sit on the sidelines and wait for them to act or sit on our hands. Given the intransigence of this White House and the Republican-led Senate, this may well be a messaging bill, as has been suggested, but it's a message that needs to be heard. So I'm excited that the House will vote on this bill for two reasons. The first being that the international community can see that the House of Representatives remains committed alongside them to address this existential threat. And second, that all of our constituents, and particularly our young people who come to our town halls and who come to our office and send postcards, will have the opportunity to see whether their representatives are willing to fight for them, even in the face of a White House that apparently values economic and political interests over our children's futures. With that, I'd yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being late. I appreciate you recognizing me. Me anyway.
I had a single budget question, Mr. Engel. I was reading the CBO score, and they said that the cost of implementing H.R. 9 would depend, let me get the quote, the cost to implement H.R. 9 could vary significantly depending on the level of effort federal agencies would devote to prepare the required plan. I was surprised that there was not more direction of the White House, given the relationship between the House leadership and the White House, in which direction this ought to go. I would have expected the president to have been directed more. What do you anticipate that to answer the CBO's question, that level of effort that would be required of federal agencies, and how will we hold them accountable for that success?
I would say to my friend that it's not a matter of wondering if climate change is happening. It's happening. It's not a matter of pointing fingers and saying China is more responsible than we are. I mean, we're all on the same planet, and so the Paris Agreement will cost little or nothing, and if we do nothing, we'll have to pay the price later on. I don't know if that answers your question, but the U.S. economy by 2018, I'm sorry, the release in 2018 predicts the U.S. economy will shrink by as much as 10% by the end of the century if global warming continues at its current pace. So, look, nothing is perfect. If I've learned one thing, that's what I've learned. But this makes a real attempt to get to the problem. If this bill is not something that can get the president's approval, and my friends on the other side of the aisle are making that point, then it really behooves all of us to sit down and put our heads together and find out something that will work. On our side, we've just been frustrated because, as the chairman mentioned, alluded to, the fact is when you guys were in control, we didn't do anything about this. And so I really want to get beyond, he said, she said, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. This is a treaty. No, it isn't. And we just need to put our heads together. There's a lot of good minds on both sides of the aisle. We ought to come up with something. I think that the way we do it is we pass this, but if we had to find down the road that we could get agreement on something else that moves us in the right direction, I don't think anybody on our side would disapprove of that. So it's sort of like we realize what's going on, but we're sort of spinning our wheels and pointing fingers at each other. I think that this is a very important thing. I think that this new majority, we wanted this to, from the get-go, to be one of the major issues that we're pushing because we feel very strongly on our side of the aisle that this is for real. This is not something that's imagined or, goody two-shoes. This is real, and we're going to suffer if we do nothing. And the crime will be that we have the ability to do something, and if we don't do it, then shame on us.
Well, I associate myself with much of what you've said. I'm a member of the Climate Solutions Caucus. I want to see us talking about solutions, not in the finger-pointing business. You led with, if this isn't something the president can support, we ought to sit down and put our heads together. I guess I might have presupposed this isn't something the president should support, so instead of being here, we should probably be sitting somewhere else, putting our heads together. You've got an able ranking member sitting beside you. There are so many opportunities that we have in a change of leadership, in divided government, and I worry sometimes that we may be poisoning a well that was already a difficult well to draw from, and I don't want to see that happen in this case. I would have liked to have seen something that was more definitive, laying out exactly what we wanted to see, what the committee wanted to see the administration do, how we were going to hold the administration accountable, what those line-by-line definitions of success were, because we could certainly start putting our heads together from that place.
But my friend, I hope will admit that as long as the president continues to take what I consider an intransigent role in doing this, the chances of actually getting something passed that's meaningful with the support of the president is virtually nil. And that's a shame, because it really needs, in my opinion, to go beyond the politics. It needs to go to what we all know is a fact. I mean, we can, I used to, when I was a kid, and we all learned that the ostrich put his head in the sand and thought that if he couldn't see anything, nobody would see it. That's what we're doing here. I believe that's what the administration's doing here. We're putting our heads in the sand, and we are not looking around and seeing the reality of what everybody knows, what every scientist knows, that climate change is real, and if we don't do something about it really quickly, the calamity to our planet will just be enormous.
I may have misspoken, Mr. Chairman. I was suggesting that we should be proffering an Article 1 solution instead of offering an ambiguous suggestion to the administration with undefined standards that are for which the administration will be unaccountable, that perhaps knowing exactly what you said to be true, that we should be leading with definition as opposed to simply encouraging the administration to lead in an area that we believe we might have disagreement. But I appreciate the gentleman's candor, and I have no further questions, Chairman.
No, and thank you, and I thank the gentleman. And as I mentioned before he got here, there's nothing that says we can't work on other initiatives together, because if we're going to deal with this issue, it encompasses a lot of different areas, whether it's agriculture or transportation or infrastructure. All these areas are areas that we need to come together on. I think to the point that Mr. Engel was making is that it is a little bit difficult to figure out how we can come together on anything when the administration, when the president says he doesn't believe that this is a real problem. It's hard to find where the common ground is if you don't believe that this is a problem that needs to be dealt with. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to everyone who's testified. I don't have much to add. I was reminded, though, listening, as I'm reminded often of this, in 1610, Galileo published a report called Sidereus Nuncius, which translates roughly into starry messenger, where he used telescopes that showed that the sun, rather than the earth, was the center of the solar system, and followed what Copernicus had said. And for that insight was brought before the Roman Catholic Church and others for heresy. He then published in 1632 a dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, which he again defended heliocentrism, the center of the earth, the center of the solar system being the sun instead of the earth, for which he was imprisoned for life and died in prison in the 1640s. Climate change is real. Scientists, as far as I know, don't dispute it virtually anywhere any longer. The notion, however, that we can't proceed until we get the United States Senate to agree with us, or certainly the president, who denies climate change even exists or that humans have had any impact on it, seems to me a ridiculous approach, and that it also suggests to me that we may be no more enlightened than the people in 1610 as it relates to science. I think we should pass this resolution. I welcome any suggestions by our friends on the other side of the aisle that there are meaningful ways to move the Senate or the White House. So far, I haven't seen it, but hope springs eternal.
Thank you. Dr. Burgess.
Did you hear what he just said to me?
What?
Speaking of hope. And you turned to me. So I'm grateful for the endorsement, Mr. Woodall. So let me see if I understand correctly. Chairman Engel, you said that you would like to see us put our heads together and the best minds work on this problem, and you and Mr. McCall both seem to have voiced that opinion. Is that correct?
Well, Mr. Burgess, you know me from the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I'm a bipartisan type of guy when we can do those things. And I think that's what the American people want us to work together when it comes to important issues that affect everyone's lives, and we've tried to do that on the Foreign Affairs Committee as well.
So let me, I may have missed it during your opening comments, Chairman Engel, and forgive me, but would you be agreeable to the Rules Committee producing a rule that would allow an open rule so there'd be ample time for discussion and debate so that all sides could be heard on this issue?
Well, I would leave that to the Rules Committee, and I would leave that to the people who are in charge of doing that, but I don't think there's anybody here that would argue against us really. First of all, in order to deal with this problem, you have to admit there's a problem. And if a lot of people on my colleague's side of the aisle won't admit that it's a problem, and as Mr. McGovern said, when the President of the United States refuses to admit that it's a problem, it's kind of hard to get anything done. It really is. And I think that's a shame, because I do think there are probably good answers on both, in both parties. And I just think that we should not be playing political games with this. We should be passing legislation.
I don't disagree with you. Just reclaiming my time, because we are going to run into votes here in a little bit. And I know the chairman always likes to finish before the vote on the floor, so I'm trying to be sensitive.
I appreciate that.
21st century kind of guy, and be sensitive to what the chairman wants.
Thank you.
I guess the frustration on this is, and Mr. Chairman, I said we have a number of amendments, and I'm going to talk about a couple of them myself. I know Mr. Shimkus has a great amendment. I hope we will make a number of amendments in order so we can have a fulsome debate on the House floor on many of these issues. But, you know, it's not lost on me. You're on the Energy and Commerce Committee. Mr. Shimkus is on the Energy and Commerce Committee. 10 years ago next week, the Waxman-Markey bill was introduced with great fanfare. Many of us remember that lengthy markup that we had in the Energy and Commerce Committee. That bill did pass on the House floor. It was a pretty close vote, but that was about the end of June, right before the 4th of July recess, if I recall correctly. And of course, the United States Senate at that time, there was a 60-vote majority that the Democrats held, and certainly were able to pass Dodd-Frank and the Affordable Care Act, and another number of pieces of big policy prerogatives of the Democrats. And yet this bill never came up in the United States Senate when they had 60 votes. It wasn't going to be handled as a treaty. It wouldn't have required a two-thirds majority. It was simply enough to cut off debate and move the question to the floor. So the votes were there on the Democratic side, but they failed to bring the bill up for a vote. And I don't know, no one's ever told me why they didn't. I suspect because it was the political backlash that people saw after the House passed this thing by the narrowest of margins on June 26th, that there was a significant political price to be paid for pursuing this type of legislation. And for whatever reason, 10 years ago, it didn't happen. Now, one of the other things that happened 10 years ago was Dr. Chu, who was the Energy Secretary at the time, asked me to come down to the Department of Energy because he wanted to relate to me all of the ways in which the climate was changing and how it was going to affect things in the world, in my state in particular. And he looked at me at the end of that very lengthy discussion and said, "I have not got good news for you. In less than 10 years' time, Texas will be in another Dust Bowl." Well, we're not only not in another Dust Bowl, we've kind of had too much rain the past couple of years, as you referenced some of your farmers have experienced. So I guess I would just sound a note of caution that be careful about the hyperbole when it comes to matters like this. I think there is a good case to be made for expanded use of energy efficiency. I've driven a hybrid for the last 15 years. Most of the reason that I selected a hybrid was because of air quality issues that we have in the North Texas area. We have a significant number of ozone days, and the largest single source are mobile sources for that pollution, and I wanted to be doing my part. The other thing was it did give me the opportunity for significant moral superiority to be driving a hybrid when other people weren't, and I've exploited that on numerous occasions. But still, it is one thing that one person can do. So every year in the district that I represent, I do an energy efficiency summit. People should understand what they're doing when they're purchasing energy. No one can have my opinion, you can't make a political platform that is based on wasting energy. I don't think that would be wise. Now, the one thing I don't understand with everything that's been discussed is why there has not been more of a focus on nuclear energy. Nuclear energy, if you really want to talk about a carbon-free energy equation, it is nuclear energy. And no one has done more than Mr. Shimkus at trying to move this country in a direction of responsible long-term storage for nuclear waste. And I have traveled to Nevada with him. I have listened to him in this Rules Committee on other occasions, and I know he feels very passionately about this. I think that should be part of this equation as well. And the fact that it's not, the fact that this is not part of the equation, the fact that we're not talking about nuclear energy as a possible carbon-free future in this country tells me that it's an unserious discussion. And Mr. Chairman, I do have a number of amendments that we'll talk about at the appropriate time, but I just hope we'll make a large number of amendments in order. And as you used to talk about when you sat on this side of the dais, it's important that all members be heard on this and that we have ample time for a fulsome discussion. And I trust the Rules Committee will produce a rule that's consistent with that. And I'll yield back my time.
And when I made that suggestion, you didn't listen to me. Time and time again. Yeah,
Chairman.
I mean, Ms. Shalala.
Thank you very much. For South Florida, climate change and sea level rise are life or death.
You need to put your mic on.
Let me repeat. In my district, climate change and sea level rise are life or death. And if we continue to do nothing, my community as we know it will disappear. There are no climate deniers in my district. Everybody knows what's happening in South Florida. We're already living with the effects of climate change, which are more frequent and more intense hurricanes, higher tides that flood our neighborhoods and eroding beaches. That's why we were so heartened when the international community came together to sign the Paris Accord. And that is why I was so devastated when the administration announced that they'd withdraw it. The Paris Agreement strengthens the international response to climate change, to adaptation, to mitigation, to capacity building. It's our best collective effort to combat climate change. We simply cannot do it alone. The withdrawal from Paris and the failure to act on climate is a mistake with global implications and catastrophic consequences for my South Florida community. And so I'm going to be very proud to support H.R. 9 because it rejects this wrong-headed decision to withdraw from Paris and requires the president to develop a plan to meet the U.S. commitments under the agreement. I have an amendment in which strengthens the bill because it makes it clear that addressing climate change means addressing its effects that are ravaging our coastal communities. And I mean by that sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, and flooding. We simply can't wait, and I strongly support this effort. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I don't know, I was a little late, but if you didn't mention it, it was Mr. Cole's birthday yesterday.
I
So
did
happy
mention it.
birthday.
And happy birthday.
Yeah, Mr. Cole. Well, I had a great time in my...
It's birthday too, right?
Oh, really? Fantastic. Fantastic.
Celebrate.
Well, you know, so what I've heard so far is that the Paris Agreement is non-binding. There's no way to enforce any other countries to reduce their emissions. There's no way to really check it, enforce about it. So I guess my question to both Mr. Shimkus and Mr. McCall is, since that's the case, and this bill would say that the U.S. has to set a plan to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below the 2005 levels by 2025, I believe it is. What do you think this is going to do to the American economy, to jobs? So you have other countries that there's no enforcement, but we're going to do this, reduce it 26 to 28%. What do you think the impact will be on jobs and the economy?
Well, thank you. I think done poorly, it'll harm jobs and it'll harm economic growth. With this chance, let me just say that Congressman Tonko and I are good friends. We've served together. Now he is chairman of the subcommittee. We've had hearings. I think Republicans have moved quite a bit. I think we should get credit, at least from the House and public policy guys, and trying to address this. Couching this in the world is ending is not the way to get Republicans. Couching it in let's find efficient ways that lower costs, keep the economy strong. Why did we have an increase in emissions? Because the economy is booming. So the contrary is true. If you reduce emissions, you may hurt the economy. I mean, so we've had a lot of discussions, Paul and I. I think if we can focus on conservation, innovation, adaptation, things that I think we've all mentioned, we might be able to get something rather than nothing. And I think something would be instructive and helpful. This is not it, but I do think we could get there.
If I could just say, Chairman Engel and I have forged a very good friendship and bipartisan relationship on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I think everybody here, at least from what I've heard, agree that this is a serious issue that needs to be addressed by Congress. And I don't think that this is it. This is doomed for failure. I think as the chairman has mentioned, I hope we can work towards a better solution, maybe with the Climate Caucus as well, to do something that's based in reality, economic reality. What I worry about, as the gentlelady mentioned, was $250 billion in gross domestic product lost, 2.7 million jobs by 2025. By 2040, you have a $3 trillion cost on the economy, 6.5 million jobs. There's a better way to do this and try to get a sensible solution that is not arbitrarily out of nowhere. Where do these numbers come from? 26 to 28% of all emissions. And by the way, China doesn't have to do anything until 2030. Nothing. And I would submit that while they have gone up, and we've debated this, we've brought our emissions down 14% since the Paris Agreement. But we can't do it alone. We do need the rest of the world to do this. And I think if there's any takeaway, sir, it would be that people like Mr. Engel and I can come back to you with a more sensible solution that makes that's realistic. We all know this is a messaging bill, as Mr. Shimkus said. We all know the president's threatened a veto, and we all know what the Senate is going to do. But I do hope that this will start a discussion towards a real solution-based climate change bill. I yield back.
I think Mr. Tonko wants to respond.
Mr. Chairman, and to Representative Lesko, we've seen a number of states take action, and it has not hurt their economy. It's grown their economy. That's a proven fact. And, you know, what we're asking for is the federal government to lead. According to analysis, the state and local commitments that are out there can get us 2/3 of the way to our national goal of 2025. All we're asking is that we fill that gap and that we act responsibly and encourage a president who is denying and offering non-scientific response to get with the program. And let's get this done, and let's do our share, because state and local governments are acting.
And Mr. Chairman and Mr. Tonka, I know it, because I'm from Arizona, I know that some of the energy policies that the state of California is doing, mandating certain levels of renewable energy that are unrealistic, they actually have to pay Arizona to take their energy. And so to me, that's not very economically viable. But I do have one more question, Mr. Chairman, if I could, I should say, to Mr. Shimkus and Mr. McCall, and that is, were any of you consulted about this bill, and were any Republican amendments accepted in the committees?
Well, on the energy and commerce small portion, the answer is no, but we really didn't expect it. So, I mean, it's just something we had to do and get through.
I would offer the same response that even my amendment in the nature of a substitute that Mr. Perlmutter thought was sort of reasonable, because I think it is, just quoting you, we're good friends. That was rejected on a party line vote. So the answer is no. I would hope this committee would take up that same amendment.
I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Dessaigne?
Yeah, I'll be brief because I know we're all anxious to hear from Mr. Davis on his amendment. I just feel compelled to jump in here for a second as a Californian who's been very involved in California air regulation. I was appointed by 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat to the California Air Resources Board. Our experience, and I actually have an amendment to this effect, when it comes to the economy is more consistent with Mr. Tomko's. And we have plenty of research that shows that. When our landmark state bill was passed in 2006, when it was signed by a Republican governor, that was to get us by 2020 to 1990 emissions levels. We're on track to do that. Now, Jerry Brown has passed a bill that says we're going to get by 2030 a 40% reduction. That's in the context of the 5th largest economy in the world. We've added more jobs than any other state, not just because of the size. We get half of the venture capital in the entire United States comes to California. That's for a lot of reasons, tech, biomedicine, but we also get more venture capital to renewables and alternatives than every other state in the country. So there's a discussion to be had here, I think, and the silver lining is some of the comments, and particularly by the ranking member the day after his birthday, about when Republicans and Democrats did work together, when the Clean Air Act was passed, when it was passed, the state passed, was there when it came to criterion pollutants. So climate's different. To the issue about change and jobs loss, there is an issue about transition, and that's a conversation we should have. I have 4 oil refineries in my district, but overwhelmingly the polling is, including from the people who work there, that they know that they're going to be working on renewables in their kids. So that's the issue that it would be really great to start to work on. But I just have to say the experience, in my personal experience in the state of California, and the overwhelming evidence that we have experienced by implementing these far-reaching policies has been an economic benefit that's fairly astounding.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate your testimony. If there's anything you want to leave with the stenographer, please do. And we'll now call our next panel, Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas, Mr. Stober, Mr. Davis of Illinois, and Mr. Burgess of Texas. And we'll begin with Ms. Jackson Lee. And I'd urge everybody to try to be concise so we can get everybody in before the vote, if possible. Ms. Jackson Lee, you can begin.
Let me thank the Rules Committee for their courtesies, and let me, from the beginning, Mr. Chairman, agree with you that we have to do something. And frankly, I believe the legislation before us does a lot, because what it asks the President to do is to develop a plan in order to meet the goals and aspirations of the Paris Agreement, which as reflected, it may be the entire world that agreed to it. My first amendment is to add to the findings to emphasize the multilateralism of this legislation and to reflect on the fact that multilateral efforts help end fascism, created the North Atlantic Treaty Agreement and the Marshall Plan. And the language specifically is that the Paris Agreement is an example of multilateral international cooperation needed to overcome challenges facing the international community, such as reducing emissions, promoting economic growth, and deploying clean energy. And I think to add that to the findings would be helpful. I do want to acknowledge that my amendment is supported by Mr. Moulton and Mr. Hayes. That's amendment number 41. I have amendment number 81, which is supported, amendment number 80, which is supported by Ms. McBath, Ms. Wilson, Fudge, Jayapal, and Mr. Kehana and Maricel Powell as well are supporters of this amendment. And this amendment indicates the need for assessing jobs. And I understand that there may be, I'd like to make the argument that this is in compliance with the underlying legislation and the Paris Agreement. There is no doubt that this ability to have clean energy jobs may create 24 million jobs. And my amendment in particular speaks to the idea of ensuring that the Department of Labor provide to Congress the number of jobs that may be impacted negatively by not having this agreement or not having this legislation. On page 6 of the bill itself, it says the United States communicated its nationally determined contribution to achieve an economy-wide target of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below its 2005 level by in 2025, and to make best efforts to reduce its emissions by 28%. And in a document entitled The World Employment Social Outlook, it emphasizes that in its executive summary, it says action to limit global warming to 2 degrees centigrade will create jobs, a transition to agricultural sustainability and a circular economy will result in more and often better jobs, and the transition is urgent given the unsustainable pressure of current economic activity on the environment. So I think the amendment that asks for the Department of Labor to provide us with a report is an important step, and I would hope that amendment will be included. The last amendment is Amendment number 81, and it is supported by a number of my colleagues, which include Ms. Jayapal, Ms. Maricel Powell, and Mr. Hayes of Florida. This amendment, I think, is important because so many of our local jurisdictions are dealing with their own ways of dealing with the Paris Agreement. And this in particular says no funds are authorized to be appropriated, obligated, or expended to discourage, impede, or prevent the efforts of any state, local, tribal, or territorial unit of government to encourage efforts by the private sector or government employees to engage in activity that supports or contributes to meeting the United States obligations under the Paris Agreement. It strictly ties to the Paris Agreement, strictly ties to H.R. 9, and I would hope that as our local governments thoughtfully look at ways to try and frame their policies to create a more healthy climate or to respond to the needs like the state of Florida or respond to the needs of the state of California, as long as it's in the confines of the Paris Agreement, that in fact that would not be denied. And I'd ask my colleagues to support my amendments 41, 80, and 81.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stover?
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, for the opportunity to discuss my amendment to H.R. 9, the Climate Action Now Act. Precious metals mining is crucial for renewable energy development worldwide and our nation's national security. Mining the minerals we need for our global future needs to continue to happen in the United States, where we have the world's finest environmental standards and labor protections. Renewable energy cannot exist without mining. Take the windmill, for example, a pillar of our renewable energy portfolio. Wind power requires minerals available in my district and across the country. A standard-sized windmill requires roughly 335 tons of steel for external housing and rebar skeletons. Steel is made from iron ore, which has been mined in the legendary Iron Range in my district for a century and a half. This windmill also requires 4.7 tons of copper for conducting electricity throughout the turbine and to its eventual storage location. And batteries for electric cars comprised of nickel, lithium, and iron, minerals that again are found throughout the United States. Precious reserves in my region will supplement our production of iron ore, providing another great option for our citizens to produce the materials necessary for renewable energies and the modern world. The United States competes with other countries to produce these metals for export worldwide, and none of our competitors have the environmental or labor standards we do. Our competitors are China, Russia, Australia, Morocco, Indonesia, Mexico, India, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Peru, and many others. And we know these countries have no incentive to take care of their workers and lack any environmental standards. Furthermore, we compete with these countries for our national security goals. The more materials harvested by these countries erodes our international standing. As everyone knows, Russia is not our friend, and we should ensure that natural resources harvested safely are powering our global renewable future. In northeastern Minnesota, mining is our past, our present, and our future. My region offers labor-protected, high-wage mining jobs with stringent environmental protections, and it is crucial we market these materials throughout the world. My amendment is crucial because it would prioritize domestically sourced materials benefiting our workers and the environment globally while keeping America's international interests safe. Thank you, Mr. Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the Rules Committee. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. McGovern, Mr. Ranking Member Cole, and the committee. My amendment is Amendment Number 26. And less than 6 months ago, we passed a 5-year farm bill with strong bipartisan support by a vote of 369 yeas to 47 nays. That bill had a number of positive conservation measures that were supported by my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that were actually geared toward reducing emissions. The Farm Bill encourages locally led incentive-based conservation. It provides investment in soil health practices such as cover crops, ultimately providing downstream benefits to communities in the form of cleaner water, cleaner air, healthier soils, and more wildlife habitat. It's critical that any bill geared toward conservation gives agriculture a proper seat at the table, given the huge role that the industry can play in conservation. I tried to get some Democratic co-sponsors for this amendment, but many were co-sponsoring one that's offered by our colleague and my good friend Ted Deutsch that requires the president's plan and updates be submitted to any committee as deemed appropriate by House and Senate leaders. However, it does not ensure the Committee on Agriculture is considered. This language offering jurisdictional discretion, and I agree with it, but I want to ensure that we recognize the importance of the conservation measures that we just passed on a bipartisan basis in the 2018 Farm Bill and the critical role that ag plays in conservation and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is why I asked the committee to support my amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have 3 amendments. First one is Amendment Number 11, which described as an all-of-the-above amendment that will include renewables, nuclear power, hydropower, and clean natural gas. Getting Congress to recognize the importance of technologies that will work to mitigate the problems. Amendment Number 12. And this, again, requires the plan to acknowledge that nuclear power generates 20% of all electricity in the United States. Texas, nuclear power is the most reliable source of power generation, producing electricity 24 hours a day. When nuclear plants close, carbon emissions rise. Whether the United States or globally, clean baseload generation must be part of any climate solution. And then finally, Mr. Shimkus had an amendment that I just wanted to speak to, which I mentioned briefly during the Q&A portion. This amendment, number 66, ensures that the United States commitments under the Paris Agreement will not raise electricity rates and gasoline prices.
Thank you very much. Any questions on the Democratic side for the panel? On the Republican side? I want to thank you all for being here. Appreciate your patience and staying with us, so you can go and vote. Thank you very much, and that concludes the, anybody else wishing to testify on this legislation? If not, that closes the hearing portion of this, of our meeting. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 9, the Climate Action Now Act, a structured rule. The rule provides 90 minutes of general debate on the bill, with 60 minutes equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and 30 minutes equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule makes in order only those amendments printed in the Rules Committee report accompanying the resolution. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
Thank you very much. As we've just heard from the gentleman from Colorado, the rule provides for consideration of H.R. 9, the Climate Action Now Act, under a structured rule which makes in order 30 amendments. The rule provides for 90 minutes of general debate, with the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs controlling 60 minutes, and the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce controlling 30 minutes. So you've heard the motion from the gentleman from Colorado. Is there any discussion or amendment? Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule to report an open rule for the bill before us today, H.R. 9. Rather than working together to produce legislation capable of accomplishing something, the majority instead rejected every Republican amendment offered at markup and chose to pursue this unenforceable and partisan legislation to try and score political points. Of the 30 or so Republican amendments submitted that do not require waivers, only 4 were made in order. Out of 30 amendments, 4. So, we can go have the vote, but I think we'll get the kind of vote that sort of bipartisanship generates on the floor tomorrow.
Okay, you've heard the gentleman's amendment. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. No. Opinion chair, the noes have it. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres, Mr. Perlmutter, Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin, Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon, Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli, Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala, Mr. Gisonier, Mr. Gisonier, no. Mr. Cole, Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall, Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess, Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko, Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 5 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule to make in order amendment number 20 offered by Mr. Curtis, amendment number 31 offered by Mr. Norman, and amendment number 52 offered by Mr. Hearn. Amendment 20 requires the President to include a report to Congress on how the United States nationally determined contribution compares to that of other nations, including China. Amendment number 31 ensures the bill does not take effect until the EPA administrator certifies that China and India are also reducing emissions. And amendment number 52 makes the job loss numbers finding section of the bill available to all. So I move that we make these 3 amendments in order.
Before we go to Mr. Woodall's amendment, can I ask the clerk how was Ms. Shalala voted on the previous? Oh, can you report the total on the?
Yes, on the last vote, the total was 4 yeas and 6 nays.
All right, thank you. Okay. You've heard the amendments from the gentleman from Georgia. Any comments or discussions or? Hearing none, the vote is on the Woodall amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Roll call has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres, Mr. Perlmutter, Mr. Perlmutter votes no. Mr. Raskin, Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon, Ms. Scanlon, no. Ms. Morelli, Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala, Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. Gisonier, Mr. Gisonier, no. Mr. Cole, Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall, Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess, Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko, Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments. Mr. Burgess, Dr. Burgess.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule that the committee make an order and grant the necessary waivers to amendment number 11 that includes the findings the United States should continue to encourage innovation and technological development.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any comments or Discussion, hearing none, the vote is on the Burgess Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair is no. Have it. Roll call. This will be requested. Clerk call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres, Mr. Perlmutter, Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin, Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon, Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli, Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala, Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier, Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole, Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall, Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess, Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko, Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
Members not agreed to. Further amendments.
Yes.
Dr. Burgess.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask to make an order and grant the necessary waivers for amendment number 12 that requires the President's plan to meet its nationally determined contribution to include how the use of carbon-free nuclear power will contribute to emissions reductions. And I ask for its consideration.
For the gentleman's amendment, is there any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Burgess Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Roll call requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres, Mr. Perlmutter, Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin, Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon, Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli, Ms. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala, Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier, Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole, Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall, Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess, Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko, Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
Members not agreed to. Further amendments. Dr. Burgess.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I also want to ask for a vote on Mr. Shimkus's amendment number 66, that the committee make an order and grant the necessary waivers. This is an amendment that would require the certification that no increase in rates would occur under the Paris Climate Plan.
Heard the gentleman's amendment. Any further discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Burgess Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. A roll call is requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres, Mr. Perlmutter, Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin, Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon, Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli, Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala, Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier, Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole, Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall,
Woodall.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess, Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko, Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman,
Clerk
no.
report the total.
4 yeas, 7
Members
nays.
not agreed to. Further amendments. Ms. Lesko.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment to the rule to make an order amendment number 43 offered by Mr. Gosar. It includes findings stating that the President shall make a plan that describes how the government, taxpayers, workers, and industries will be affected by the Paris Agreement.
Heard the gentlelady's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Lesko Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Roll call.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres, Mr. Perlmutter, Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin, Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon, Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli, Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala, Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier, Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole, Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall, Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess, Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko,
Aye.
Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman,
Clerk
no.
report the total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
Members not agreed to. Further amendments. Ms. Lesko.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule to make an order and provide the necessary waivers for amendment number 32 offered by Mr. Duncan from South Carolina. This amendment conditions H.R. 9 to take effect only if the Senate ratifies the Paris Agreement as a treaty.
You've heard the gentlelady's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Lesko Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Roll call, please.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres, Mr. Perlmutter, Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin, Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon, Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli, Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala, Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier, Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole, Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall, Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess, Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko, Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
Members not agreed to. Mr. Cole has an additional amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule to make an order amendment number 26 offered by Mr. Davis of Illinois. The amendment includes the 2018 Farm Bill as an existing law relevant to achieving the stated target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As a result, it adds report jurisdiction to House and Senate Agricultural Committee. This bipartisan amendment shows important bipartisan and bicameral steps Congress has taken to reduce greenhouse gas emission. This amendment should be made in order because it opens up the discussion to a common ground framework.
Appreciate it. I heard the amendment from Mr. Cole. Any discussion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I would, this is an important amendment. And Mr. Davis came up here to offer this amendment. We should make this in order and have his amendment part of our discussion.
Appreciate it. Any further discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. No. Opinion chair, the noes have it. Roll call. Roll call.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres, Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin, Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon, no. Ms. Morelli. No. Ms. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala. No. Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole. Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall. Aye. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess. Aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko. Aye. Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No. And can I ask how Mr. Raskin is recorded?
Mr. Raskin is not recorded. Mr. Raskin, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
Clerk, report the total. Amendment is not.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
Are there further amendments? Hearing none, the vote is on the motion from Mr. Perlmutter. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Clerk, will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres, Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, aye. Ms. Shalala. Ms. Shalala, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mrs. Lesko. Mrs. Lesko, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk, report the total.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
Motion is agreed to. I will be handling it for the majority.
And Ms. Lesko will be handling it for
Okay, and I think that brings this hearing to a close. I will just remind everybody that tomorrow at 10, we're going to do a hearing on Medicare for All, and we will begin at 10 o'clock, and there'll be coffee available, and I expect a lively discussion, and when Dr. Burgess is doing the questioning, there'll be scotch available for those who would like it, but it will be a good day. So, yeah, right, absolutely. This brings an end to the hearing.